The cake sat on the dining table, a sugary monument to a life they thought was ending. 65 candles flickered, their tiny flames dancing in the dim light of the room. My son, Mark, stood beside me, his arm draped heavily over my shoulder, a practiced smile plastered on his face for the dozen relatives watching us. His wife, Susan, was filming on her phone, cooing about what a perfect family moment this was. They were all playing their parts so beautifully. The loving son, the caring daughter-in-law, the grateful old mother. It was a scene worthy of an award. My 6-year-old granddaughter, Lily, bless her innocent heart, toddled over and tugged on my sleeve. I looked down at her, the only genuine smile I'd felt all day gracing my lips. She looked up at me with wide, serious eyes and said, in a voice loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Grandma, Dad said you're going to a nursing home after this." Silence. The fake smiles froze, then melted away. Mark's arm tightened on my shoulder, his fingers digging into my bone. Susan's phone dipped. Every eye in the room darted between me, my son, and the little girl who had just detonated the truth. They thought they were just putting me out to pasture, a final, tidy solution to the burden of my existence. They had no idea I owned the pasture, the farm, and the very house they were living in. You're probably wondering why a son would plan to ship his own mother off to a facility on her 65th birthday. To understand how we got to this sickening, candlelit betrayal, you need to understand that for 30 years, I wasn't their mother. I was their bank, their maid, and their stepping stone. And tonight, for the first time, I was about to make a withdrawal. My life has been a repeating pattern of sacrifice. The role of the family workhorse was assigned to me early on. I had an older brother, David. To my parents, David was the sun and moon. He was the investment, the one destined for greatness. I was reliable. While David got new clothes for every school year, I wore patched-up hand-me-downs. While he played sports and went out with friends, I was expected to be home, helping my mother with chores or working my part-time job at the local diner. My paychecks didn't go into a savings account for my future. They went into the household fund, which always seemed to have just enough extra for David's new baseball glove or trip with the school band. When it came time for college, my parents sat me down and explained that they had only saved enough for one child's tuition. It was for David, of course. He was going to a 4-year university out of state. For me, they said, community college was a more practical option. I didn't argue. Arguing was pointless in my family. It was like shouting at the rain. So I worked 2 jobs, paid my own way through a local 2-year program, and learned to expect nothing. I thought I'd finally escaped that dynamic when I married Frank. He was a kind, decent man who saw me for who I was, not what I could provide. We built a good life and had 2 children of our own, Mark and Sarah. But my curse, it seemed, was hereditary. My parents, now doting grandparents, immediately latched onto Mark. He was the man of the house. After Frank passed away from a sudden heart attack, leaving me a widow at 45. My daughter, Sarah, quiet and observant like me, was often overlooked. The pattern began again. All the pressure, all the expectations, all the little extras were funneled toward my son, Mark. And I, softened by grief and desperate to give my son the father he'd lost, started down a path of accommodation that would nearly cost me everything. Mark's needs started small, then grew like a weed. It began in college. A few $100s here and there for books, which I later learned was for beer. Then came the $5,000 for a surefire tech startup with his roommate that vanished within a month. Each time, he'd come to me with a story, his eyes full of desperate ambition. He knew exactly how to frame it, not as a handout, but as an investment in his future, our family's future. "Just this one last time, Mom," he'd plead. "This is the one. I can feel it." And my parents would echo his words, telling me not to stand in the way of his potential. Meanwhile, my daughter Sarah was a ghost in our family story. She worked her way through state school, waiting tables just like I had. She never asked for a dime. She bought her own used car, paid her own rent, and slowly built a life for herself. Mark and my parents called her cold and distant. "She doesn't care about this family," Mark would say after I'd just written him another check. "Not like I do." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it, but I was too blind with a misplaced sense of duty to see it. Then Mark met Susan. If Mark was a slow leak in my finances, Susan was a burst dam. She was polished, ambitious, and saw me not as a mother-in-law but as a resource to be tapped. Their wedding was the first major blow. They wanted a grand affair, something straight out of a magazine. When I hesitated, Susan cried, and Mark accused me of trying to sabotage his happiness. "Is this because you never had a big wedding?" he asked, a cruel and calculated blow. So I did it. I walked into the bank and took out a second mortgage on the house Frank and I had worked our whole lives to pay off. They promised they'd help with the payments as soon as Mark's new venture took off. But it never did. Instead, they came to me a year later with another proposal. "We need to save money," they said. "Can we move in with you just for a few months?" The months turned into years. They took the master bedroom, complaining the guest room was too small. My own home started to feel like a hotel where I was the permanent, unpaid staff. Living under the same roof, the nature of their campaign against me shifted. It became more intimate, more psychological. They began chipping away at my confidence, piece by piece. It started with small things. "Mom, you left the front door unlocked all night," Susan would say with a sigh of feigned concern, even though I knew I had locked it. "Mom, are you sure you should be driving? You almost ran that stop sign," Mark would add, recounting an event that never happened. They were planting seeds of doubt, not just in my mind, but in the minds of anyone who visited. They were building a case, brick by brick, that I was becoming incompetent, a doddering old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own life. The constant stress and the feeling of being a stranger in my own home wore me down. I was tired. So tired that when Mark came to me with a sheaf of papers, I barely had the energy to resist. "It's a power of attorney, Mom," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. The discovery came by accident. A credit card statement was mailed to the house, but it was addressed to me, not to them. I opened it out of habit. The list of charges made my blood run cold. A $5,000 trip to a Caribbean resort. A $2,000 designer handbag for Susan. Weekly dinners at restaurants I couldn't afford on my entire monthly budget. When I confronted them, their masks came off. "We deserve a little something for all the sacrifices we make taking care of you," Susan sneered. Mark was worse. "It's my inheritance, Mom. I'm just getting it a little early." When my daughter Sarah called to check on me and I tearfully told her what was happening, Mark snatched the phone. He told her she was a jealous, bitter woman trying to poison me against him. The shame and confusion were so overwhelming that the next time Sarah called, I didn't answer. I was truly alone. Being truly alone was a cold, terrifying gift. With no one left to lie to me and no one left for me to lie to myself, the truth was unavoidable. My son and his wife were not just selfish, they were predators. They weren't just taking my money. They were systematically dismantling my life and my identity, preparing me for a final disposal into a state-funded memory care unit once my accounts were dry. That night, sitting in the cramped guest room of my own house, the exhaustion and the shame finally burned away, leaving something hard and clear in their place. Resolve. I remembered my husband, Frank. He was a meticulous planner, a man who always prepared for the worst. Years ago, shortly before he died, he sat me down at the kitchen table. He'd slid a thick, leather-bound folder toward me. "This is your get-out-of-jail-free card, Martha," he had said, his voice serious. "It's a series of trusts and investments in your name only. I've been funding it for years. Don't ever touch it. Don't even think about it unless you are in real, desperate trouble. and don't you ever tell the kids about it." At the time, I thought he was being morbidly paranoid. Now I saw it for what it was, a lifeline thrown across time. The next morning, I told Mark and Susan I was going to a seniors' luncheon. Instead, I took a bus to the city and walked into the law office of Frank's old estate planner. Mr. Gable was a kind, elderly man who remembered my husband fondly. I explained my situation. He listened patiently, then smiled. He pulled out a file that dwarfed the one my husband had shown me. The power of attorney I had signed, he explained, only gave Mark control over my simple checking and savings accounts, the household money. It was a pittance. The real assets, the house, the surrounding land, a substantial stock portfolio, were all held in the Franklin Trust. And as the sole trustee, I had absolute untouchable control. The money they had been stealing was from a financial wading pool. I was the silent owner of the entire ocean. A cold, beautiful sense of calm washed over me. The trap wasn't for me, it was for them, and I was about to let them walk right into it. The silence in the room was a physical thing, pressing in on all of us. Lily, sensing the sudden tension, hid behind my legs. Mark's hand, still on my shoulder, felt like a lead weight. It was Susan who broke first, forcing a brittle laugh. "Oh, Lily, sweetheart, you weren't supposed to say anything. It was a surprise," she gushed, turning to the bewildered family members. "We found the most wonderful place for Martha, a luxury retirement community. It has a pool and art classes. It's more like a resort, really." Mark quickly jumped in, finding his footing. "It's for the best, Mom," he said, finally releasing my shoulder to address the room. His voice was full of that practiced, patronizing concern he had perfected over the years. "You need 24/7 care. We were worried sick about you being here all alone." I let them talk. I watched them spin their web of lies, turning their cruelty into an act of profound love and sacrifice. I saw some of my relatives nodding along, accepting this fiction because it was easier than confronting the ugly truth. I let the performance continue until they had dug their graves deep and wide. Then, I turned my head slowly and looked directly at my son. My voice, when it came out, was quiet, calm, and carried to every corner of the silent room. "A nursing home," I stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "You were going to send me to a nursing home, and you chose my birthday party to celebrate it." "We weren't celebrating it, Mom. We were going to—" "And whose money?" I interrupted, my voice as sharp and cold as ice. "Were you planning to use to pay for this resort?" Mark actually scoffed, a flicker of his true arrogance showing through. He waved a dismissive hand. "Your own, of course. We've been managing your finances for you, remember? It's all taken care of." "I see," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face for the first time that evening. "So you admit you've been managing my money." That was the last piece I needed. On that cue, the front door opened. Standing there was my daughter, Sarah, her expression one of grim satisfaction. Beside her stood Mr. Gable, my lawyer, holding a thick leather briefcase. The party was over. The proceedings were about to begin. Mark's jaw went slack. He stared at Sarah, then at the stern-faced man beside her, his bravado evaporating like mist. "What is this? What is she doing here?" he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at his sister. Mr. Gable stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the coffee table with a soft, definitive click. He didn't look at the other family members. His focus was entirely on Mark and Susan. "My name is Howard Gable," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I am your mother's attorney, and you," he said, looking at Mark, "have been served." He slid a crisp, folded document across the table. Mark stared at it as if it were a snake. He hesitantly picked it up and unfolded it. His eyes scanned the first few lines, and a choked, incredulous laugh escaped his lips. "An eviction notice? Are you kidding me? You can't evict me from my own house." He looked at me then, a sneer twisting his features. "Mom, what is this senile nonsense? You signed the house over to me 2 years ago, remember? It's my property." "I'm afraid you are mistaken," Mr. Gable said smoothly, not missing a beat. "This house, and the entire estate, has been the sole property of the Franklin Trust since 1998. Your mother is the exclusive trustee. The document you coerced her into signing was a fraudulent transfer of title, which was nullified by a judge last Tuesday. You own nothing." The color drained from Mark's face. Susan let out a small gasp. But Mr. Gable wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second, much thicker document. "This, however, is something you do own." He handed it to Mark. "This is a full, itemized accounting of the $182,456.17 you and your wife have misappropriated from your mother's personal accounts over the last 4 years. I have already filed the necessary paperwork to have that sum converted into a legally binding personal debt, which you will be required to repay with interest. Collection proceedings will begin in 30 days. Susan finally broke. A shrill, ugly scream tore from her throat. "No, you can't do this." Mark simply stood there, pale and silent, the papers shaking in his hand. The party guests, my entire extended family, watched in utter shock, finally seeing my son not as the golden child, but as the common thief he truly was. With the legal machinery laid bare, it was my turn. I stepped forward, away from the shadows of the living room, and stood in the center of the stunned circle of relatives. I looked at Mark, at his ashen face, and at Susan, who was now sobbing into her hands. There was no pity in my heart, only a vast, cold clarity. "For years," I began, my voice ringing with a strength no one in that room had ever heard from me. "You have told a story. You told it to yourselves, and you told it to everyone here. The story of the devoted son and his wonderful wife, burdened with a fragile, aging mother. You painted my daughter, Sarah, as selfish for building her own life, while you praised this leech," I said, gesturing to Mark, "for staying behind to bleed me dry." I let my gaze sweep across the faces of my siblings, my cousins. "And all of you, you bought the story. You watched them move into my bedroom. You saw them driving new cars while I wore the same coat for 10 winters. You heard their little whispers about my forgetfulness. You saw the truth, but you chose the lie because it was more comfortable. You are all witnesses to what he did, and your silence was his greatest weapon." A murmur of shame rippled through the room. I didn't give them time to recover. "So now, let me tell you the real story. The story of what happens now." I stood up straighter. "This house will be sold. All of my assets are being liquidated and restructured. I am moving to a beautiful condominium to be near the only child who ever truly cared for me, Sarah." I smiled at my daughter, who smiled back, tears welling in her eyes. "My will has been rewritten. Everything my husband and I built will go to Sarah and her children." "Mark," I said, my voice dropping, "you and your children will receive nothing. Not a single cent." Finally, I turned to my son and his wife one last time. They looked utterly broken, 2 spoiled children who had just had all their toys taken away. "You wanted me in a home. You were so eager to put me away. Well, you have your wish. You've made me homeless. So I'll return the favor. I hope you find a nice small apartment somewhere, because as of today, you are homeless, you are deeply in debt, and you are completely and utterly cut off. You have nothing." The fallout was as swift as it was brutal. Stripped of their home and their unearned income, Mark and Susan's sham marriage crumbled under the weight of real-world pressure. They moved into a cramped, run-down apartment across town. The luxury car was repossessed. The designer clothes were sold for pennies on the dollar. Faced with a mountain of debt and the prospect of actual work, Susan left him within 6 months, finding another man to finance her lifestyle. Mark, the boy who was promised the world, was forced to take a job stocking shelves at a grocery store, the public humiliation complete. He tried to send my granddaughter, Lily, to my new condo to ask for money, but I was prepared for that. I had Mr. Gable set up a tightly controlled educational trust in Lily's name, one that Mark could never touch. I would see my granddaughter, but I would never again see my son. The most important work, however, was rebuilding the bridge my son had burned. I sat with Sarah on the balcony of my new home, the city lights twinkling below us. "I am so sorry," I told her, the words I had needed to say for years finally coming out. I was so lost in his lies that I couldn't see the truth standing right in front of me. I let them turn me against you. Can you ever forgive me? Sarah took my hand, her eyes shining with tears. "There's nothing to forgive, Mom. I'm just glad I finally have you back." In that moment, I wasn't a victim or a victor. I was just a mother, reunited with her daughter. My life found a new rhythm, one of peace and genuine joy. I spent my days with Sarah and her husband, and my 2 other grandchildren who had only ever known me as the sad woman who lived with Uncle Mark. We baked cookies, went to the park, and read stories. They knew nothing of the drama, only that their grandma was finally happy and present. 1 year after that disastrous party, they threw me a new one for my 66th birthday. There was a small, store-bought cake, a handful of candles, and the sound of my grandchildren's laughter. As I looked around the table at the faces of my real family, I felt a sense of profound peace. I had lost a son, but I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and myself. Justice had been served.